Welcome to A Cloud of Witnesses. This is an in-depth series on the history of the Christian faith. In this video, we'll examine the rise in influence of the papacy and focus in particular on Pope Gregory. We'll also look at historical developments of the late 5th and 6th centuries, noting the impact of the Ostrogoths, the Visigoths, and the Franks. And we'll conclude with a discussion of Benedict of Nursia and his Benedictine Rule, and note the impact of this rule on Western monasticism. We have already noted the attacks of successive barbarian armies on Rome and the end of the Western Roman Empire. In the year 410, Alaric the Visigoth had sacked Rome, and as a result, the Western Roman Empire was considerably weaker. Into this vacuum, the Church at Rome and its leader, the Pope, would over time become the most significant and influential of all the churches in Western Europe. The most influential pope at this time was Leo I, sometimes called Leo the Great, who was pope from the years 440 to 461. Leo was called the first pope in the political sense. He'd risen to the position through the ranks of the church bureaucracy, and at the time he took office, the civil government of Rome had already become ineffective. In the year 410, Alaric the Visigoth had sacked Rome, and as a result, the Western Roman Empire was considerably weaker. Like the earlier Pope Damasus, Leo claimed that the Bishop of Rome was the successor of Peter, and therefore the spiritual heir of the so-called keys given to him. Evidence of this view can be seen in the events surrounding the Council of Chalcedon in 451. Now, Leo did not appear in person at the council, but rather sent a tome. Now, a tome was a large scholarly book or an article. In his tome, he expressed the subsequently adopted position that Jesus was one person with two natures. But what's significant to Leo's claim of papal authority was that Leo forbade the other bishops to subject his tome to the scrutiny of discussion. Although the council adopted the stance taken by Leo, the Eastern bishops continued to maintain their independence of judgment. As also mentioned before, Leo intervened with Attila the Hun in the year 452, which led to Attila agreeing not to destroy Rome. 3 years later, Leo negotiated with the Vandal leader, Genseric, when he marched on Rome. Leo opened the gates to Genseric on the condition that the people were not killed and the city not destroyed. These two incidents enhanced Leo's prestige as a diplomat and revealed that the papal office was more significant than that of the ineffectual Roman emperor. About 40 years after the rule of Leo as Pope, the Ostrogoths under Theodoric the Great invaded and took over Rome in the year 493. The Ostrogoth control continued until 537. In 493, the Ostrogoths set up their capital at Ravenna in northern Italy. Now, the Ostrogoths were Arian, and they opposed those in the church that held to the Nicene Creed, and they also influenced papal appointments in this period. The role of the Ostrogoths became clear in the first schism of 498, when both Symmachus and Laurentius were elected popes. Symmachus was approved by the Roman Senate, but Laurentius by the Byzantine Emperor Anastasius I. Both papal claimants resorted to bribe King Theodoric for his support, And this is the first documented case of papal simony, where both candidates attempted to bribe the royal councillors and to influence his choice. Both these candidates lived in Rome for a number of years, and the dispute led to physical clashes between supporters. A number of synods failed to resolve the issue, and Theodoric remained neutral, but eventually he threw his support behind Symmachus. Laurentius left the city and gave up his claim to the papacy. Pope John I was sent on a diplomatic mission to Constantinople by King Theodoric in order to negotiate a better treatment for Arians. Although he was relatively successful, upon his return to Ravenna, Theodoric had him imprisoned for allegedly conspiring with Constantinople, and there Pope John died of neglect and ill treatment. Pope Felix IV, who was appointed in 526, was more or less the selected choice of Theodoric, and Theodoric's son and later his nephew continued to influence papal elections or selections after Felix had died. Pope John II was the first pope to take on the practice of a papal name, i.e. a new name after he was appointed, and this would be a practice that continued throughout the centuries down to the modern day. By the early part of the 6th century, there would be an increasing rivalry which would then become an open conflict between the Ostrogoths and the Roman Empire, which was now based in the east with its capital of Constantinople. Theodoric died in 526 and was buried in Ravenna. The Ostrogoth rule over Rome ended soon after, with Ravenna falling to Justinian, the Byzantine emperor, in the year 540. With the coming to power of Justinian as the Byzantine emperor, there was an attempt to retake areas of the west that had been occupied by the barbarian tribes. Under the Byzantine general Belisarius, the Vandal kingdom in North Africa was conquered in 533. Belisarius then marched up the boot of Italy, and he took Rome in 536 from the Ostrogoths, and then later took all of Italy, capturing the Ostrogoth capital of Ravenna in 540. Ravenna then became the capital of the Byzantine Empire in the west. With the capture of Rome, the papacy now became under the nominal political control of the Byzantine emperor, and popes were for a while confirmed by the emperor. During these years, Italy was left desolate and Rome's population dropped only to a few thousand. Justinian also moved against paganism, and he closed the influential pagan school at Athens. As mentioned, Ravenna was now the capital of the Byzantine Empire in the west, and Justinian's support of the church can be seen in the example of the Church of San Vitale, which was completed in 547. As we've already mentioned, it was Emperor Justinian who had the Hagia Sophia built. After Justinian died in 365, the Byzantine bureaucracy at Ravenna became weaker, and there was also a threat from the Lombards who, in the year 569, had moved into the area of northern Italy. The papacy filled the void of this weak bureaucracy, but as noted, the East was still influencing papal selection. Then, in the year 568, the Lombards invaded and took control of parts of southern Italy and threatened to also push on to Rome. The church looked for a new power for support, and they looked to the Franks of modern-day France. The Franks had become Christian in 496 when their king Clovis had been baptised. Now, things would eventually change when the Lombards accepted the Christian faith under the influence of the Celtic missionary Columbanus in the early 7th century. The Franks from eastern and northern France were initially pagans, but they became Christian when their ruler Clovis became one. Now, prior to this decision, Clovis had married a Christian woman. Then, on the eve of an important battle, Clovis made a promise that if he was victorious, he would follow his wife's God. The battle was won, and so in the year 496, Clovis was baptised, along with many of his nobles and 1,000 of his warriors, by the Bishop of Reims. The Burgundians were from southeast France, and they were initially Arian, until the year 516, when their king Sigismund converted to Orthodox or Nicene Christianity, and soon the rest of the kingdom followed. Then, in the year 534, the Burgundians were conquered by the Franks, and so the whole region was united. Now, the Franks were Orthodox, as mentioned in their doctrine, and early on they were the only Catholic kingdom in the West, and they were to be very important to the Papacy and its power. Meanwhile, Spain were ruled by the Visigoths, who were also Arian. However, King Gregory was converted to Nicene Orthodoxy in the late 6th century, and along with many nobles was baptised. And then in the year 589, Nicene Orthodoxy was officially embraced at a synod of Toledo. King Gregory attended the Synod of Toledo in 589. It should be pointed out that a synod was more of a localised meeting of church leaders, so its decisions only had regional or national implications. A council was much broader and included all the church. And of course, an ecumenical council included the different churches such as the Roman West and the Orthodox East. We're now going to leave the broad brushstrokes of national events to focus on a couple of important individuals from this time. And the first is Dionysius Exiguus. Dionysius Exiguus, or Denis the Little or Denis the Humble, was a monk from ancient Scythia, which is in modern-day Bulgaria and Romania. He moved to Rome and thereafter wrote a codification of church laws. He was also the monk who calculated back to the birth of Christ and gave us our calendar. This he did around the year 525 or possibly 532. However, in his calculations, it's believed that he was out anywhere from between 1 to 7 years, most likely the higher figure. It was Dionysius who used the words Anno Domini, translated as AD, and BC, before Christ, that have been used in our modern dating system. He also asserted that the 25th of December was the date of Jesus' birth, although other dates had been suggested. The argument for this date had already been a calculation based on when the incarnation had started, in other words, when Mary had originally become pregnant. It was argued on theological grounds that this took place on March the 25th, and therefore 9 months later was the 25th of December. Although it is believed that Athanasius introduced monasticism to the West through his writings, it was actually Benedict who provided the definitive rules for Western monasteries from the early 6th century onwards. After living as a monk for about 3 years in the Anthony fashion, Benedict realised that solitary monasticism had its disadvantages, so, like Pachomius, he organised a communal monastery, and the Benedictine order began. He soon had so many followers that he had to organise 12 monasteries in all. In the year 520, he established perhaps the most famous of all of them, the Monte Cassino monastery, which is near Naples in Italy. Benedict stayed at Monte Cassino for 14 years, where he cultivated the soil, fed the poor, and looked after the sick. His monastery was missionary orientated, and he personally had concern for the needs of the poor in the area. His biographer, who was Pope Gregory the Great, claimed that he healed the sick and even raised the dead. Benedict wrote down an important set of rules to govern the lives of the monks, and this became known as the Benedictine Rule. Broadly, the directions stated that each monastery was to be independent and run by an abbot, whose word was final and who was elected for life. However, even the abbot was to be subject to the rule, and he was meant to consult senior monks. Each monk was to be bound to the one monastery for life. The day for a monk was divided into set periods, and it was designed to allow adequate time for sleep, but also include times for labour. Over the 24-hour period, there were times for work, meals, devotional worship and prayer, and of course, sleep. There were to be 8 communal gatherings for prayer and worship. 7 were held during the daytime, and 1 was held at night. And this was justified on the basis of Psalm 119 verses 164, which said, 7 times a day I praise thee for thy righteous ordinances. And Psalm 119 verse 62, which said, at midnight I rise to praise thee because of thy steadfast ordinances. At each of these meetings, the Psalms and other scriptures were recited. In a week, the whole Psalter would be read through, so that most monks would eventually know the Psalter by heart. These meetings or gatherings would have names such as Vespers and Compline. Other monasteries had much longer evening sleep and sometimes were able to sleep in more than this pie graph shows. Benedict said of his goal regarding the monastic life was,
in honour to prepare one another, let them bear most patiently with each other's infirmities, whether of body or of character. Let them be content with one another in their obedience. Let no one follow what he thinks most profitable to himself, but rather what is best for one another. Let them show brotherly charity with chaste love. Let them fear God and love their abbot with sincere and humble affection, and set nothing whatever before Christ, who can bring us to eternal life.
The specific rules within the Benedictine Rule were quite extensive, as this list shows. If you notice that the rules didn't promote austerity or asceticism, because adequate food, clothing and shelter was to be provided. The rules included to leave the poor, to clothe the naked, to visit the sick, to bury the dead, to console the sorrowing, not to make a false peace, not to forsake charity. While perhaps these rules were a noble aspiration, they were to be kept in order to obtain merit for the purpose of gaining salvation. Behold, these are the instruments of the spiritual art, which, if they have been applied without ceasing day and night, and approved on Judgment Day, will merit for us from the Lord that reward which he hath promised. It's important to note that this idea of merit for attaining one's salvation would become very important in later Catholicism. Benedict's rules established communal living and included physical or manual labour, and idleness was actually seen as an enemy. Meals were to be eaten together, and monks were not allowed to own property. Unnecessary conversation was to be avoided, and there was an emphasis on periods of silence. Communication with the outside world through letters was only given with the permission of the abbot, and venturing outside the monastery was not encouraged. The monastery was to be self-sufficient as much as possible. However, monks could leave the monastery if they so desired. Work included the transcribing of the Bible or other important works, as it had been in Cassian's monasteries. And over time, monks wore a distinctive haircut called the tonsure. There were also females who wished to take up the monastic life, and they were called nuns, and they lived in a nunnery, often also called a convent. The leader of the nunnery was an abbess, and nuns, like monks, had three important vows. They were poverty, chastity, and obedience. However, there were problems or maybe even dangers within the rule. For example, there was to be discipline in the monastery, which included isolation and exclusion, fasting, in some cases corporal punishment, and in more extreme cases, expulsion. The rule said, "Whoever is excommunicated for graver faults from the oratory and the table, let him, at the time that the work of God is celebrated in the oratory, lie stretched, face down in silence before the door of the oratory, at the feet of all who pass out. And let him do this until the abbot judges that it is enough." Now, the oratory was a small chapel. If a brother has often been corrected and has even been excommunicated for a fault and does not amend, let a more severe correction be applied to him, namely, proceed against him with corporal punishment. But if even then he does not reform, or, puffed up with pride, should perhaps, which God forbid, even defend his actions, then let the abbot act like a prudent physician. And if, as a last resource, he has employed the caustic of excommunication and the blows of the lash, and sees that even then his pains are of no avail, let him apply for that brother his own prayer and that of the brethren, that the Lord, who is all-powerful, may work a cure in that brother. Perhaps the greatest danger of the rule was that it was very much works-based. So there was the danger of legalism. It seems like joy and assurance were not focused on in the rule. There was an emphasis on repetition and rote learning, which wasn't always pleasing to God because it removed spontaneity from worship. And as we've seen, even laughter was frowned upon. Monks lived a life of almost perpetual condemnation of their own inadequacies. We could also surmise that sleep deprivation occurred. The emphasis on silence is seen in this quote. "Therefore, because of the importance of silence, let permission to speak be seldom given." Even laughter was to be suppressed. Chapter 6 said, "Coarse jests and idle words or speech provoking laughter we condemn everywhere." The seventh degree of humility is when not only with his tongue he declares, but also in his innermost soul believes that he is the lowest and vilest of men, humbling himself. Chapter 8 of the Rule illustrates that sleep was often interrupted. The brethren will rise during the winter season at the 8th hour of the night, so that having rested till a little after midnight, they may rise refreshed. The time, however, which remains over after the night office of matins will be employed in study by those of the brethren who still have some parts of the Psalms and the lessons to learn. There was also the issue of the problem with enforced celibacy, and we've seen this issue in the present day. In fact, in some cases, children were also sent to monasteries. Chapter 39 mentions this. And chapter 59 says, if it happened that a nobleman offers his son to God in the monastery and the boy is of tender age, let his parents execute the written promise which we have mentioned above. We're not told, though, how young people or children would enter the monasteries. And chapter 63 says that children are to be kept under discipline at all times and by everyone. And finally, obedience to the abbot. This was obedience not necessarily to God. So the question needs to be asked, was this a life of liberation or was it a life of servitude? We can see in some of these quotes from the rule that personal freedom was limited. Even letters and communication with the outside world were controlled by the abbot. Chapter 54 says, let it not be allowed at all for a monk to give or to receive letters, tokens or gifts of any kind, either from parents or any other person, nor from each other, without the permission of the abbot. And the monk even has to let the abbot know all about his personal faults. Chapter 7 says, the fifth degree of humility is when one hides from his abbot none of the evil thoughts which rise in his heart, or the evils committed by him in secret, but humbly confesses them. And chapter 49 says, let each one, however, make known to his abbot what he offers, and let it be done with his approval and blessing, because what is done without permission of the spiritual father will be imputed to presumption and vain glory. So in this setting, the question needs to be asked, is this more like a cult or a very closed community where everything is done without question? Despite these concerns, monasteries following Benedict's rule were set up across Europe, and nunneries developed along the lines of his rule too. Although study was not initially the focus of the Benedictine monasteries, later it became very important. In the large monasteries, copying of manuscripts, both ancient and modern, took place. They were then kept in their libraries, called a scriptorium, and so important works were preserved for later generations. Through education, monks became church leaders, philosophers, architects, expert farmers, musicians, glassmakers, builders, and advisors to kings. For the next 600 years, education and other civilizing activities were almost entirely in the hand of the monasteries. Some monks worked amongst the community, providing for the needs of the poor, or for travellers, or for the sick. Yet there were also strict monasteries where the monks had little or nothing to do with the outside world and weren't even allowed to speak to each other. Their lives were to revolve around quiet meditation and prayer. There were other negatives too. As monasteries became popular and received substantial gifts, the monks grew complacent and the abbots lived well. From time to time, reform or renewal movements were established to get back to what was seen as the true goals of monasticism. Western monasteries, like those of Pachomius in Egypt, had similar buildings, and here is one example showing the layout of a monastic community of the West. We now come to one of the more influential, or perhaps most influential popes of this period, and that's Gregory I, who's revered by Catholics as Gregory the Great. In fact, some historians see the Middle Ages as starting with the ascension of Gregory to the papal throne in 590. Now, Gregory was born in Rome. Around the year 570, he became mayor of the city. He was converted and renounced his secular career and became a monk. Then in 577, he became a church deacon, followed by an abbot, and finally, the Pope. He was the first monk to rise to the rank of Pope. Like Leo I, Gregory claimed the universal sovereignty and dominion of the Roman See over other bishops. He was critical of the Patriarch of Constantinople for taking on the title Ecumenical Patriarch. In other words, he was claiming to be the universal patriarch. And Gregory said the patriarch was proud, profane, wicked, blasphemous, and the forerunner of the Antichrist. Gregory, claiming to be in contrast, took on the title of Servant of the Servants, a title which has been used by all later popes. Gregory was also interested in mission. He encouraged mission to England, and it was he who sent Augustine of Canterbury to England in the year 596. He was also interested in mission in other parts of Europe, such as Germany. He helped to protect Rome from the Lombards. And during his rule, the papacy grew in wealth, prestige, and power throughout Western Europe. He raised the profile and the authority of the Church and the papacy in new areas such as in France, among the Franks, in Spain, and in England. He also attempted to reform the clergy and the monastic orders. For example, he punished the sale of church offices, which was called simony. He also had a concern for the poor, and after becoming pope, he used income from the papal lands to feed and care for the many poverty-ridden Romans. As a result of these concerns, he became very popular among the poor people. There were also theological changes. For example, communion. Instead of becoming or being a memorial, it was becoming a sacrifice with the modern concept of the Mass. Gregory was also one of the first to endorse the doctrine of purgatory. In this, he was influenced a little bit by Tertullian and Ambrose on Augustine. And this idea of purgatory naturally led to the idea of praying for the dead, which is mentioned in the apocryphal book of 2 Maccabees 12, 42 to 44. There was also the growing idea of praying to the saints, and as we've discussed earlier, the increasing adoration of Mary. We've also mentioned the ideas of a priesthood and also celibacy becoming normative. There was an increasing view of the separation between clergy and laity. And he used pictures and images in the church, which he termed the poor man's Bible. And he also encouraged the use of relics, and possibly also introduced or encouraged the development of the Gregorian chant. The word medieval comes from two Latin words meaning middle age. The medieval period, or the Middle Ages, have been further divided into three different periods: the early, the high, and the late. The Middle Ages are followed by what has been termed the modern period. But when did the medieval period or the Middle Ages begin? Well, some say it happened to start with the fall of Rome and the deposing of the last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, in the year 476. Others, though, see it starting with the ascension of Gregory I to the papal throne in 590. We've now come to the end of this video. In the next video, we'll be examining the Celtic movement and look at the lives of influential men such as Patrick, Columban, Aidan, and Cuthbert. We'll also compare and contrast Celtic beliefs with that of Rome And we'll note that how England eventually accepted Roman practices at the Synod of Whitby.